All right, I think that's a sign it's time for us to get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion on sustaining a global force in training technology across the Air Force enterprise. I'm Colonel Anthony Graham. I am the commander of the Air Force Agency of Modeling and Simulation, and it is my pleasure and honor to be today's moderator for the panel today. We have a distinguished panel in front of us today of leaders across the United States, major commands. They're going to be able to answer a couple questions I have and answer any questions you guys may have. First, I'm going to start introducing them by, first we got Colonel Chris Finch from HAF A3T. We've also got from Air Force Global Strike, Colonel Matt McDaniel. We got Colonel Shane Garner from ACC, Colonel Justin Dahlman from AMC, and Mr. Jason Miller from AVSOC. Today's discussion, we're going to focus on the role of modeling and simulation in support of Air Force global operations, and how can we leverage the technology to improve our training and also our readiness to making sure we're getting ready for GPC. The ROE for today is I've got a couple questions that I've got lined up for the panel, but I know you guys didn't come here to hear me talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a couple questions, and we've got people going around with the index cards that'll be able to take any questions you guys may have, and then we'll ask the question from there for the panel. But before we get started, I'm going to give the panel members 2 to 5 minutes to kind of introduce themselves and talk about what they're doing currently right now. We'll start off with Harm.
Thanks, ABC. Everybody, Chris, I go by Harm Finch. I got in the seat at Headquarters Air Force A3TI in July, so we own policy and oversight with a little bit of a funding look as well on modeling and simulation, simulators, ranges, emitters, so everything that gets our Night 1 warfighters ready for the fight. So that's what I've been out and about seeing. So as you ask your questions, I would say I'm ready to answer what my favorite color is, but the hard questions need to go to Dahmer because he's the real expert. So, because it's big, it's a really big portfolio when we're talking about training and making us ready for Night 1. The threat's evolving constantly, multiple threats, and we've got coalition and joint integration requirements as well as our own service. So a lot out there, and I want to say, thank you to what industry folks are doing. Everyone that's down on the floor out there is bringing something to the fight. There's ex-service members, academia, full-time industry that has a patriotism drive to get us to what I think will help us win in that readiness piece is deterrence, mass, a robust industrial-based, a joint and coalition fighting force that is using the greatest technology in the world to overtly show what we could do if you asked to pick a fight with us. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and we'll probably get into it in the next hour and a half, but I'll pause there. Thanks.
Awesome. My name is Matt McDaniel. I go by Angus. I'm there at Global Strike as a Deputy Director of Operations. Had an opportunity to be in the A3T as well, so logging some serious time in Louisiana, which is fascinating. It's fantastic. But part of Global Strike, you're going to see that we have a deep legacy of our aircraft and our platforms coupled with emerging and new capabilities. So for some, the B-52, which is my background, we have 3 generations of aviators who've been through that. I applaud you all for continuing to make that relevant for us in the training environment. It's not easy. If you think about it, those simulators are 60 years old. They used to put them on trains and cart them around the country. And now we're asking for something like a B-21 simulation that is a 6th-generation bomber. Of course, that's not all that Global Strike does. We have the B-1, the B-2, of which you guys are sustaining beautifully. Truly appreciate that. Timely and ready, however, is really what we're looking for. We always talk about the eaches. We have a training event. Our aircraft may be struggling that day. Are we able to simulate? It has to be relevant and timely, and I appreciate you for trying to get after that. As you look at it, I have a 19-year-old. He's grown up in a world that's wildly different than my days in just interactions with technology. So I applaud you guys for continuing to push the envelope. Now, while he's working on his PhD in Call of Duty, I'm still just a meat shield. But the reality is you're seeing that there's a tremendous called generational gap in how we learn. You are pushing this model forward for us, and I truly appreciate it. I will say the Global Strike is both maintaining our legacy systems. Those are our UH-1, our Minuteman III missile, and those bombers that are out there, while extending into the future with new technologies like the 139, the helicopter that we're just fielding up in Malmstrom right now, as well as the Sentinel and the B-21, of course. So thank you. I'll echo that. And again, we probably need more, but you can bring us faster. That would be my plea for the warfighter that's out there every day in the snow and the cold of Minot, North Dakota. So thank you.
Afternoon. I'm Shane Garner. I go by Dahmer, and I would say that I'm very happy to be a part of the rich history of bombers as a B-1 guy, but I'm just as happy to be living in Langley Air Force Base, working at ACC, avoiding the swamp in Louisiana. Thank you for taking that. So my division at ACC runs test and training requirements, and I just wanted to give you a quick view of what the profile is like, just to give you some context for potentially some of the questions that might come up. So we have a live ranges branch, and some of the programs that we run out of that branch include the live mission operations capability, which is a C2 capability that's supposed to unite all of the ranges from the backyard ranges all the way up to the large level 3 and 4 ranges like Nellis and J Park to provide a command and control, but also some simulation to support the live fight. In addition to that, we have combat training systems to include P5 and P6, and then the ARTS programs, which currently V3 is the largest part of that, but also leverages simulation, not in a virtual environment, but in the open air environment. So transitioning to two of our other branches that deal directly with simulation, we run kind of the big box simulators for many of the fighters and some of the ISR platforms. And then an additional branch which has a lion's share of the work is our network training branch, which runs requirements for the joint sim environment and for distributed mission operations. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk about both of those programs quite a bit. Typically, JSE tends to pull a lot of the oxygen out of the room. Very important program moving forward that we're developing. However, there is the other DMO is still shouldering a lot of the actual workload currently. And then the final branch is our operational test branch. So probably not as applicable to this forum, but we do run full-scale aerial targets out of that branch, of QF-16s and our subscales. We do Seek Eagle, and additionally, the branch runs basically baseline operational tests for the CAF. So a lot of things like cyber and major platform stuff. Part of that OT mission, though, is evaluating simulators, and I know some of our 29 TSS fans, our friends are in the crowd today, to understand how the mission of simulator evaluation is going to be a huge part of how we move forward in assessing our capability to use the capabilities that come out of industry and some of those capabilities that are delivered. So just quickly, my background is an operational tester through B1 and some other programs out at Edwards. And what I would say applicable to this forum is that we're really good at delivering capability to the warfighter as far as hardware, but what seemed to be present, and I really realized it a little bit more once I started this job, was delivering the training systems that go along with it. So really good at getting that missile to fall off the jet, really good at working the bugs out of the software in the airplane, but not quite as good with the contractor as far as making sure that we're adequately funding and working through the training system end of it. With that, I'll hand it over to Colonel Dahman.
Yeah, Colonel Justin Dahman, Air Mobility Command, Aircrew Tactics and Training Division Chief. So we own the programmatic oversight and development of aircrew tactics across the mobility air forces, as well as the training development. Applicable to this forum is really, and where I've spent a lot of focus this week, has been our aircrew training systems, our simulators. And we've got in upwards of 90 full motion sims across 50 different locations. So, I'll echo the DMO and the importance of DMO and that connectivity between systems is where we're going in AMC and where we've been really pushing to better our systems to get more efficient in pilot production We work very closely with 19th Air Force and AETC on the syllabus is pushing through our formal training units to better the pilot development through technology and partnership with our industry hosts that are here this week. We also own the rated management portfolio as well as air medical evacuation and a lot of different support entities that flow into the training environment for MAF aircrew. But really excited to be here. This was my first year at ITSIC. I've been really impressed and walking the floor out there, it really opens up your aperture of what could be, right? And it's hard to get there at times. As I think we all have been there and experienced, right? The bureaucracy is real and trying to bring these things to fruition. Something that we fight and that we'll probably talk about today is fighting those niche capabilities, right? When I talk 16,000 mobility airmen across 1,200 different aircraft, 16 different platforms, I have to come at these situations with a whole of mobility Air Force approach. I don't need a system just for a niche capability in one. I prefer a system that can span across all systems that we can contract and update accordingly and make sure that are relevant to prepare our airmen for the fight tonight. But appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm Jason Miller. I go by Dutch. I really appreciate the invite to be here today. I'm at Headquarters Air Force Special Operations Command. I work in the A3T in the Training Systems division on the branch side there. And so I'm responsible for all the training systems that come across that AFSOC brings to bear. And just as some context of what we're thinking about at AFSOC, we're really undergoing two transformations. One is a transformation that everyone's undergoing, that some of our best training over the past several decades have been with sustained combat operations. So that's an advantage of that, but the disadvantage is that our operators have been very good at fighting the last war. And so as we transition, like everyone else, into going to the next conceived conflict, we obviously need to leverage the modeling and simulation side of things. The other transformation that we're undergoing is that AFSOC has significantly divested their program flying training, their pipeline first qualification in the airplane from the command. And we did that to open up our simulator time, our training system time, to get after the next conflict and to get after that higher fidelity training with our units. So I really appreciate, this is my first ITSIC. I've been in the seat for just a few months and a very eye-opening affair. I really appreciate what everyone's bringing to bear and to show us. It gives us some idea how we can advance ourselves to continue to develop our air crews and our ground crews for the next fight. And I appreciate being here.
Thank you. Okay, start off first question. When I first came in the Air Force 20 plus years ago, we seemed to be always vendor locked with the companies we went with. And what would happen is we'd get one company would make part A, another company would make part B, but we wouldn't see part A and B ability to talk. So then the military had to make it a choice. Do we go with part B and then whatever they can offer kind of fill in that point that may not be as good as A, or what do? We just go without that. During my time this week, I had some spare time, was able to walk around the floor. I was able to talk to a couple of the vendors out there, and I kept hearing some key words that were to me were very good. Open architecture. And I think that's what the Air Force we're looking to go toward, more open architecture. So the first question is for the Air Force members here, and also, how do we transform our current modeling simulation ecosystems to become more of an open architecture system, and how can the industry help us do that?
So I'd be happy to start off and challenge the question a little bit and say that I think that we have had some success in the past in doing standards, common standards. And again, I'm going to talk about DMO a little bit again, because it is a the workhorse for a lot of training in both MAF and CAF training, and I know, and can't speak to Navy, but I know the Navy is very into DMO as well. But we've been very successful at taking a bunch of federated systems, to your point, which is the basis of the question. We have a bunch of federated systems, but we've been able to find a way to bridge them together through DMO standards. Now, the problem is that it's not always satisfying for everybody, because we are interpreting between federated systems. And so to move the question forward, I think where we'd like to go is JSE. So this is where, you know, a lot of the work in my division comes from the network training branch, where when we push forward into developing JSE, I think the most important thing we want to do is bring everybody on board, not to have a common, you know, interpretation of the standard, but to live the standard. And the standard is GSI. That is the document that directs different vendors how to participate in that common space, rather than going through a bridge. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of challenges bringing everybody on board, and this is where I think the industry discussion starts. And I think, and I'm not a businessman, but I think part of the problem has been, how do we develop a business model that benefits industry and allows them to grow, and also benefits the military through our training objectives. And I think maybe we haven't focused so much on how that part of the effort is going to go, the business model of being able to grow businesses and sustain businesses, when kind of the expectation is that we want them all to produce kind of a common product, because of course intellectual property and those types of things, they don't necessarily blend well together. But at the end of the day, I think we have had some successes through DMO, and I think JSE does provide us one venue or one road to go down as a pathfinder to figure out, can we actually bring all of these federated systems and platforms and get them to play together on the same standard, in the same architecture, and still to the benefit of everybody involved.
Yeah, I double down on that. Big picture, looking forward, we need to have, we'll call it a playground of the future, a digital architecture that's going to help us innovate quickly and across platforms. I understand that major weapon systems invest a lot of time, energy, and effort into providing a coherent weapon system. But I've seen such great gains as we look out, small businesses bringing a product to the fight so much earlier. In fact, we had one recently come back and ask us if they could get some more work, not because they wanted to get paid more, but because they loved what they were doing. And I know it's not just altruism, but I do appreciate the patriotism that people bring to that. We do need to, I think, as a military, set a standard, hold to the standard, ensure that it's a fair playing field for folks as they enter in, and then actually have a coherent schema, a way forward, if you will, on what strategy we are trying to pursue. I think sometimes it's just schizophrenic. We see the bright, shiny object next versus having a way forward. And so I think we owe you that in the audience, as far as what are we asking for. Please do bring new ideas, because I'm confident we don't have all the good ones. But then to have a digital playground where we can actually meet and folks can compete well, and then be rewarded for that effort. I've seen some really cool things through federated systems. But the reality is sometimes I think we're our own worst enemy as we enter in, going from that small business or the SIBR into something sustainable. So I'd argue that we need to, as a military, get better at sustaining things, not just coming up with good ideas.
Yeah, and if he doubled down, I'll triple down on that one. It's a common architecture is actually key for us to continue to push into the future towards DMO, JSE, all the above, right? We call it SCARS, the Simulator Common Architecture Requirements and Standards, and that needs to be the baseline as we continue to progress. Some of my simulators are upwards of 50 years old, right? And it's hard to get them to a common place in this day and age. But that is the way forward that we're pushing towards, to continue to increase our ability to build that connectivity between our multitude of sites. And it's across the gamut of design, operations, security, and management. It's an absolutely, from a math perspective, it's an absolute imperative that we, the folks that are going to fight together, right, wherever it may be, practice and build readiness together, right? And it's and that's how DMO, the Distributed Mission Operations, through our distributed training center there at Scott Air Force Base, is how we get after it.
I don't think you'll have anyone not push common standards and open architecture. And I think it becomes the cost of admission. And the cost of admission goes two ways. One, for industry to put something forward, and two, for the government to hold the line and not go after what may be a more capable device and less connectivity, and accept a less capable device because it has great connectivity. And connectivity, open architecture standards, you have to explore a little bit of the detail. The coin of the realm is not just being able to connect, it's also being able to connect what I'll call without consequence. In other words, that when I connect a device to another device, or to a virtual or a constructive, that to all players, everything looks the same. And that's very difficult because we have pursued different display generators, different databases, different network protocols that we've gone through. And that is one of the things that is really slowing us down into getting to this ideal, whether it be SCARs or something else that can communicate across the networks, give the same presentation to all the air crew and ground crews involved, and so that when you're looking at something that's ground-based, it is at this exact location and not 2 miles away from that location, which we have seen. And that's the difficulty. So that's really the cost of admission that goes for both ways, both on the government side and industry.
Yeah, and industry gets it, right? I think what I've seen this week and the folks that I've talked to across a multitude of our industry partners is they get it. They understand that. They're coming to terms with it. And we need contractors. We've got a multitude of them, and we need them to play nice together, right? And it's and that is, I think, the price of admission. Yeah. I agree with that.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of piggyback on that, and you guys talked about, I think it was Dolman that actually said about the 50-year-old sims you have there. It's always been the Air Force's philosophy is to train like we fight, but we've got fourth and fifth generation fighters, for example, that have sims that don't have the ability to talk to each other. So if they can't train each other now, but now we're expecting those same individuals to go into the war, a near-peer war, how do we do that? So how do we, as an Air Force and with industry help, find a way to integrate those older sims that we have, the B-52s, with that F-35 that we're bringing on board now? What are some ways that we can help industry help us integrate those old sims into the new ones?
I'll jump on that one initially. So the answer is it's tough because we're moving towards a high-end threat environment. So JSE is where we're going towards. The fourth generation aircraft with a fifth gen, a B-21, a sixth gen eventually, CCA, there's a multi-level security problem right there. So multi-level security is incredibly important. When you put an OFP, a physics-based OFP in JSE, and you go to an effects-based simulator, an FMS simulator, a fourth gen simulator, and to put those environments together, they don't necessarily complement each other well. The high-end environment, and the reason why we're building that model of highly contested, realistic threats, the outside world digitized, is so we can see what the threat would do and what we do against the threat. And we could potentially connect some of those fourth gens, but it's at the cost of fidelity. And now you're fighting with time. So the aviator flies a sortie, real world lands, goes across the street and do a JSE event, or does he go to a DMO? Does she go to a DMO? They're probably, with time, we don't want to go to the high-end threat environment. So we're wrestling with that. DMO, absolutely, for CAF and MAF is valuable. Our Guard folks use it as well. The Navy, our coalition partners use it. That backbone potentially could be the entity that connects some of this high-end stuff as we bring it up online and stand up future sites for JSE and operational enclaves. And then maybe this multi-level security problem enables us to connect some of those force gen pieces. But circling back, I guess the fifth down, whatever quadruple the fifth down is on the initial question, the acquisition strategy, our future aircraft are all going to be JSE compliant. The B-21 FMS simulator is JSE. So we're wrestling with the question of how many fourth gen do we bring forward, and as a Viper guy, like I might say, we're not. Is the Viper going to be a night one player? Maybe, but how far back? So that's kind of what we're wrestling with is do we? And if we do decide to, there's going to be some security and fidelity that we've got to wrestle with.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that real quick. I agree 100% when you talk about who's a night one fight, where are they located at? Because there may not be a need for every one of our fighters to be able to train with an F-35 because they won't be in the necessary same area in that responsibility with that F-35. So that's one thing we need to look at. I think when we look at, we talk about all the sims, they're older, how do we bring them together? But is there a need, and maybe we have money that can be spent better other places for those sims instead of trying to bring them up to be able to fly with the F-35. When real world, they wouldn't be doing that. This was actually from the audience. It talks about JSC, and it says, why is JSC not a joint program?
I'll take that one. It's interesting. I was actually sitting with the PMA 205 division chief for lunch, and we had this kind of conversation as well. And I think the answer is that inside baseball is that there's a little bit of fear of other joint programs and some of the onerous admin that falls on those programs. And in a lot of cases, I think there's an opinion that it makes it hard to progress. And so there's basically a little bit of fear in the community to establish something as a joint program. And then there's several examples of programs that are shared between the services, and some of the examples that came up were several missile programs, AIM-120, Air Force leads that. Obviously, the Navy is a user. AIM-9, Navy's the lead, and obviously the Air Force is a user. So I think there's a spectrum of programs out there that have joint equities, and in another happenstance of events, I had a quick meeting with the joint staff gatekeeper today regarding the requirements, documents as they're going through process, and whether or not JC should be a joint program. And obviously the simple input to that is, well, the first word is joint, so isn't it a joint program? But I think what we really need to focus on is what is the objective. We want to have a virtual environment that everybody can play in. And I think establishing the standard, and I referenced it earlier, the grid or the GSI standard as the way that no matter what service or allied country you come from, you have kind of the keys to the castle on what it's going to take to participate in a high-end joint environment, or not joint, but a high-end virtual environment that is joint. But do we really need to, from acquisition perspective, do we need to label it joint? Because I think what we're doing right now is we're working through the requirements and the pain points together between the services, and we're moving pretty quickly. I don't know if just labeling it a certain way is really required to ensure success.
I'd argue that the J is still silent on that JSC model, but the reality is it goes back to the objective. And if you can't see your platform or your capability inside of this digital domain, organizations aren't going to put their time, sweat, and resources into it. And so I think that's the friction point right now, is where do we go as an Air Force? Where would we go as a joint force? Where do we go with our allies and partners? And we've talked a little bit about it. We have zero trust issues that we could use your help to solve, by the way. We have multi-layered concerns about the capabilities that we bring to the fight. I do think we would probably help the cause if we define the standard classification of it, as well as the requirement of what you need to bring to the fight to play. And that will help, I think, holistically kind of build that future fight. And I think oftentimes, JSC, we've asked too much of it already. Is it a test platform? Is it a mission playthrough platform? And I think that is a struggle that I've seen. Does a B-52 need to be part of JSE? I'd argue not. And I hate to say that because I'll get voted off the B-52 island for that. But the reality is the munitions that it brings to the fight are what we really need to be concerned about. That JSC of the future also needs to be a place where our air battle managers and our command and control functions and our intel and ISR community has a place to play and coordinate with those Night 1 fighters. I think that's where we'll make ground in the joint environment, if you will, especially if you see that, hey, I need the Navy out in front on the edge, I need the F-35 out in front, I need the munitions coming across the horizons, and I need to have something that's resilient to cyber and all of the other things that the enemies are going to array against us. So I think right now that's our problem, is we don't have enough of my vision of what I can be inside of this architecture.
I'll just piggyback real quick. I think we get hung up on fidelity a lot, and that kind of centers the conversation of JC. But we just got done talking about common standards, and I think that's a big part of the conversation. Me and Harm were talking about this a couple weeks ago. You know, we really want high fidelity for test and training purposes, but one of the side benefits, and what I would assume would be a primary benefit of JSC, is that we're not going to be federated. If everybody accepts the same standard, and if the DoD or the government or Air Force says, we're going with GSI, you may do it for high fidelity reasons, but you might also do it as NGAD, as a new player, as B-21, as a new player. You're not going to have to now maintain two separate simulated environments the way that F-22 is going to have to do that. They're going to maintain their full mission sims in their own virtual environment, but they're also going to have to maintain a separate JSE version of that. And I think that's the side benefit, is to stop doing two sim environments and everybody just come to the same sandbox.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about AI, how we can use AI to help for leadership decision. I guess it was probably about 3 years ago. I had an exec, and she used to write my speeches for me, and I was like, man, this exec, first lieutenant, really good at writing these speeches. You know, she's an academy grad. Like, oh, they really teach something different at the academy. She was coming out and writing A1 speeches where I would make very minor tweaks to these speeches. And then one day we're having a conversation, and she introduced me to ChatGPT. I was old, so I didn't know much about ChatGPT and AI, how to plug and play. But now we're seeing AI becoming even more prevalent with how we use for decision-making in the Air Force. So the question is, can you envision a future where modeling and simulation is used to support more of an anticipatory or proactive defense postures rather than simply reacting to emerging threats?
So ABC, I think the fundamental piece of this is trust, right? So is that speech amazing? Absolutely. Is it the same fidelity when I'm talking about nuclear deterrence? And so I think there has to be trust. And I think that has to be still humans in the loop, making sure that what we are asking for is what we get, and then also that it's actually functional. It is a fantastic capability. You can write some papers and books and build some music for days, but the reality is you still have to go back and validate that. There is no easy way to build a 15-year maintainer except by 15 years of maintenance. And so I think there's some experience that goes into it as well. Certainly we can help shape that dialogue, but you still need to have experts. I'd equate it to kind of the iPhone. My kids are fantastic with that device, or any smartphone for that matter, but they couldn't build one. And we take that back. I'll use the Minuteman III as an example. There's technologies that they use slide rules with that we can't replicate today. Think about that. Slide rules build something that transcended what we have today. Now, they're still making good out in the missile fields today, but the reality is a new technology doesn't always equate to learned knowledge over time. And so I would put that in there, cautiously optimistic about AI. I like your speech recommendation. Probably should have Googled that up before I got here.
I've got some opinions too. ChatGPT wrote mine, and it said we've got to buy more ChatGPT, which is weird. So there is some AI out there right now in its infancy that, thinking big, there is a potential that we can solve this. So, for example, there's metadata and AI is what the Air Force is thinking about, but curating it, getting it out to the user is important. So what do we do with the data? I don't know. What do I do with the AI? You need to tell me. You guys need to get behind the door. Let's get it in there now, and we'll figure out on the backside what this data and AI can do. But for example, what if we were able to track from pilot training until I'm ready for a night one fight, all my skills, all my pickle buttons in the sim, in the jet. I'm doing my initial training, and then I complete my wingman flight lead, and I'm ready to go to a virtual red flag and a JSE. And we've got AI red air already in JSE could be pilot in the loop on the red side, or it could just be there ready to go. And we've got AI blue that's looking to do the best objective meeting while meeting all the requirements that the mission commander said. And then we inject all of our baseball cards, all our data, before we show up to red flag. As we are going TDY, there's a million iterations of that night one push being run against red air by our blue air, that's AI. And I show up, the real mission commander gets the lineup card and goes, Harm is really bad at doing this one thing. He always leaves late, and he's gonna die, and he had all the SDBs that were gonna take down this target. So most likely, you guys need to not let him fly, or let's really train that out, right? So we can kind of find the failure points early. And in reality, that should never happen, because with this AI, when I'm training at my base in prep for red flag virtual, that I know that that's my failure point. And my commander can get after me, and my DO and the weapons officer can get after me and train that stuff out. So when we eventually get to a real night one push, we've got the frontline team that we know is going to go out and win, and we've iterated on that, and we've practiced it and rehearsed it. So yes, I do think there is a world where AI can get us on the leading edge of that.
I'd lob in the cautionary, though, not that I don't agree. The reality, though, is data management is key. I can't tell you the number of times that we input the incorrect data in and expecting some kind of miraculous save coming out of it. So I think that would be part of it. The services would have to get right with what we have actually injected into the machine. Otherwise, ChatGPT is going to be interesting but not relevant. The other thing, though, is I'd be curious and cautious about the fog of war. As many, we'll call it millennia, we've been trying to solve the problem of how do we react under the stressors. They may come out like gold, they may not. You probably brought the SDBs to the fight, independent of what the computer said. And so it would be a caution to say that you still need leaders, you still need people that have been there and done that to be truly exceptional at it. Again, knowledge plus experience equals excellence, I think. And so I think they can definitely be complementary, but just as a cautionary. And that sounded like an old guy. Anyways, I'm getting there.
Yeah, I do think there's opportunity there. I do think you can make a 15-year maintainer in less than 15 years with AI. As long as you're ingesting it with the right data and the right inputs, you could probably make it in a fraction of the time and actually better, with the thoughts and the experiences of many versus the one. I think in an aircrew environment, there's absolutely opportunity in the training environment, in the simulation environment. And AI is much like us sitting on stage and everyone out there, right? It requires reps and sets as well, right? And to do that, we have to put it in the game, right? And that's where modeling and simulation is a prime opportunity to further AI and understand what it does and see how it reacts. When I think of the MAF and in our distributed training center at Scott Air Force Base right now, when we do what we call a MAF mission profile, so it's a classified environment. We're throwing threats. We've got maybe a C-17 from Charleston interacting with a C-17 from McCord and a KC-135, call it from MacDill, right? All in the same training environment. We're throwing threats at them, and they're reacting accordingly. We have a team of people, humans, that are actually acting as the red force, acting as the aggressors, and acting as the blue force as well, and owning that battle space where I think AI could do it. And AI could actually come up with those profiles in a more novel basis and eventually adjust based on that air crew's performance, right? If they're performing well and they're integrating well together, maybe you increase the heat a little bit, right? Or the opposite, right? If they're struggling, if it's a brand new co-pilot aircraft commander on each one of those platforms and they're just not getting it, right? Maybe dial it back a little bit automatically, right? And the AI could and should be able to do that. Right now we have humans doing it, right? Which is great, and it's an amazing training environment. But I do think if the data is correct and you ingest it properly and you give it the proper reps and sets it needs, just like humans, I think you could probably, I think it would excel.
I think I'm the oldest, so I want to get that chat thing from you because that's just something that's new. But I do think there's a role in several different roles at several different levels for AI. First, going on with the aircrew training, I know all of my instructors that I've had a particular knack of finding my weak area and exploring it. And so that is something that is very, very useful that we could use AI on a very tactical level. The other thing, and I'm going to raise it up a little bit because you talked about decision makers, if we do happen to get into another fight, it is very unlikely we will be in the fight we contemplated. It will be somewhat different. But there's a couple things that we're pretty sure it's going to be. It's going to be fast. And it's going to include an enemy that is adaptive and learning. And that's where I think having not only air crews, ground crews, and decision makers exposed to an adaptive and learning enemy on a fast pace is incredibly useful. And the better we get at learning to adapt to that and get inside the decisional cycle of our adversary, the better we're going to do at the next fight. So I think there is, on several different levels, a role for AI.
Okay, great. Throughout this week, and probably since I've taken my job here 5 months ago, we've talked about how M&S can help with their pilot production, help me get a maintenance officer or maintenance troop on the flight line faster, be able to do their job by doing that training in the modeling and simulation environment. But there is always a line that we've got to cross to say, when is it going to be more valuable for the airtime versus that sim time for the students? I've always been a fan of simulation. I always felt like for the tactical piece, I was a better instructor, and my students got better instruction in the sim because I had the ability to push pause. Talk about what just happened, and then now let's go back and make that correction. Versus in an airplane, I've got to recreate what has happened there and hope that student remembers. But as I talk to folks now, they talk about the airmanship piece, the getting that aircraft in the air, and we've got to have that. What's you guys' opinion on how much sim versus airtime do we need? And is there a line, or is it going to be the same for each platform?
It's evolving, right? So it's, very different from when we grew up, right? Where it was mostly airtime, right? And now I would say it's evolving to be mostly sim. And we're going that direction even further as we look to increase throughput to meet the Air Force's demand for 1,500 pilots per year, right? We can't get there right now. And so AETC is coming up with novel solutions on how to do that. And a lot of it is compressing the training or finding novel ways to do it faster while maintaining quality. I believe, a lot of the stuff on the floor, technology in general can help that. I think you got to have a tiered approach to do it, and you got to embrace. Nothing in my mind replaces the value of classroom, face-to-face, and study, right? But I think that's a very foundational baseline. But then I think there's tiers of VR, there's tiers of AR, then there's the full integration into a simulated environment, and then there's the aircraft itself. And you got to try and maximize and tweak each one of those to figure out how do you capitalize on each one to the max extent possible, and what is that tipping point of each. But I think, I definitely think there is, we haven't hit that, we haven't fine-tuned enough yet, right? And I think our senior leaders are going to be talking about that exact point in next week's Air Crew Summit up in DC. but how do we maximize each component of pilot training using technology to minimize time and touches on these aging aircraft?
I'd say I would take the easy road and say it depends, right? So, and as our capabilities become more and more advanced and we have fewer and fewer options to train to them, I think the model of saying we should fly 50%, sim 50%, I don't know that it really applies anymore, because we can't really do 50% of the things that we need to do in the airplane. You know, a lot of the capabilities that are coming online, we don't have the infrastructure, and we don't necessarily want to be advertising how we're using those capabilities. And so I think when I look at the spectrum of training, you know, there's a lot of things that AETC could look at and say, you know, maybe it's a little bit more wide open when I'm teaching basic airmanship. You know, I got a couple of demos this week of some headset technologies with eye tracking that basically said, you know, where are my eyes looking? And I think I can infer from that what is a person thinking. And so when they're first sitting in an airplane, I could teach cross-check by letting them take that headset home and work through the cross-check at home, and then we could just evaluate how their cross-check develops as they're doing any type of particular task. Now, when I look at, well, I want to start introducing long-range kill chain capabilities, and you know, we're going through the entire gamut of long-range fires coming in and using CCAs and using every capability that's available for the high-end fight, most of those things would not fall into that 50-50 bin anymore. And so this is where we say, you know, we're going to stop having the conversation that says you have this many flat hours to execute and this many sim hours to execute. And we're going to look at each one of those tasks and say, well, when you're doing this AFRIGEN task, or when you're doing this certifying task to go fight the specific fight that you're going to do, here's where we need you to be able to get the airmanship involved with that, and here's where we need you to get the specific mission tasks and integration that you need to execute to that tactical environment.
I'm kind of torn on this one. You certainly need to do reps and sets regardless. And that simulation, I think, is a fantastic opportunity to do so. It is an opportunity to go and do a task over and over again to build the reps that you need. I was seeing in my lieutenants and captains, one, they were wildly more brilliant than I. They were certainly more motivated than I was, and we didn't give them the opportunities, either in the jet or in the simulation, that they needed to become exceptional. However, I don't think you can replace the dynamic nature of flight. You can try to simulate weather, you can try to simulate the air traffic control, but there are going to be parts and pieces of that you cannot replicate in a simulator. I think we can get very close. However, I do think you need to connect all of the parts together to have a coherent whole. Now, do you need a 35-hour simulator to tell you that you know how to fly the B-2? Well, they do, and they get them. It seems like a lot of time in a simulator to me, by the way. But the reality is you cannot necessarily replicate. I think you can get close, but I don't think it's going to be the be-all, end-all. I'll tell you right now, they are looking at, and AETC is trying to do it best, to the Aircrew Summit next week. They're trying to find faster ways to make it a reality. Our airline pilots today basically get checked out in a simulator. This may not give you warm thoughts stepping into the airplane, but their first flight may be with passengers. Now, granted, those aviators have thousands of hours before they ever hit that simulator, and that's the difference between that young lieutenant coming into the service. So I think there's only one way to gain experience, and it's by doing, and so I think you will continue to need to fly airplanes. Some of it basic tasks, some of it high-end. I do want to double down. Some of the environments and the ranges that we're talking about now, due to the weapon systems that arrayed against us, do not allow us to train in an airborne environment. You would need all of the Western United States. And so that's where I think simulation plays a tremendous capability that we don't have at the moment. So, yeah.
I think there's a definition of simulator that may get skewed here. So many years ago, when we were doing most of the flight training during flights, we came up with simulators to make the time during flight more valuable. In other words, the simulators, you were able to work on the road skills, and then the flights you were able to actually bring it on home. But you had to have a lot of flights to get there. And over the years, the simulators became better training tools, and we naturally gravitated to that. And the reason I started off with the definition is I want to pull that analogy left from the simulator to some of the very interesting technology that's coming out in part task trainers. So if we can move that training to the left and out of the high fidelity simulators and do those things in the high fidelity simulators you can only do in the high fidelity simulators, then naturally when you get to the flight phase, you are reducing the time required during flight and wear and tear on the airplane. So the idea is to be able to move that left with the right devices. And I imagine we'll end up talking about mixed reality and virtual reality. But there's some very interesting things that ATC is exploring so we can move that left. The other thing, and you had kind of mentioned it when we talked about putting goggles on, but consider this. This generation of new aviators learns a lot differently than certainly I did. And I thought I was a visual learner. And they're much better visual learners than I could be. And so one of the things that we have found that newer aviators learn a lot when they're with their iPad or with their iPhone, and things that are exportable to that to get them some skills rather than just sitting there looking at a flight manual are very, very efficient to now extrapolate that all the way to the right side of reducing flight time and wear and tear on the airplane.
Let me double down on that. It's such a, we lose a lot of momentum when we stop training. And we see that from their initial qualification. They'll go for months without flying anything, where I could see that iPad or whatever that application is actually a way to continue their growth until they are able to get back into the aircraft. I would say there's, I'm not quite sure, maybe I can solve this for us. I've seen some great simulations for weapons for defenders or even devices for maintenance, but it's very, very hard to replicate the minus 17 below in Minot, North Dakota, turning a wrench on anything. And so there's going to be basic knowledge, and then there's going to be application knowledge. And I wouldn't recommend building a minus 17 below simulator for us. I don't need that. You could just follow me up north to Minot. But that's the reality, is that you have to, there's going to be some things that I'm not confident we can necessarily simulate to the point of excellence.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to the point made earlier, we got to be careful when latching on to some of these simulated environments and training tools, that there's not a negative training aspect to it, right? Concurrency is a word we throw around a lot, and whatever simulator device, whether it's a part task trainer with VR goggles or an actual full motion sim, it's got to fly like the airplane, right? Or it is negative training, and I made mention right at the beginning of this panel of I don't want niche capabilities, right? It needs to be filtered in, and the aircrew need to receive credit for what they do, and that concurrency is a key piece of that, right? It can't be just additive on top of everything they do already. Their bandwidth is already low, and what we've seen with virtual goggles, different training tools that we've pushed out to the field, and if we don't make it part of the curriculum itself or have a training requirement associated with it, it's novel. Once you're out of that honeymoon effect, it just sits in the corner and collects dust, right? And it ends up becoming a very expensive paperweight. So that concurrency piece of it is absolutely key, and that's one thing that, as the MAF looks at trying to better our tools for training across our Mobility Air Force air crew, pushing hard for that concurrency to make sure the training is creditable, it is relevant to the aircraft and their operating environment specifically.
Yeah, and in addition to concurrency, there's just overall generic accuracy of the environment. And reaching back into my test background, verification and validation resulting in an accreditation is a huge expense that for a small customer isn't always justifiable. So when we talk about federated simulator systems, each individual MWS is now a small customer. And being able to do a very robust validation of that environment to say that when the pilot is, maneuvering the aircraft, how accurate is that aero model, how well is it interacting with the environment? Is it accurate? It's akin to concurrency, but the problem is that with federated systems, we have the opportunity to do that. With a common environment, a very robust, high-fidelity common environment, I don't know, something like JSC maybe, I don't know, I heard that somewhere. We now have a lot more investment because we're bringing together all of those different users to individually bring their resources to bear to say, hey, we're all going to be playing in the same place, and we all contribute a little piece of our pie to make sure that we do a robust validation on the environment so that not only are our cockpits concurrent, but the environment that we're fighting in accurately represents the physical world.
Absolutely.
A great answer. And that's a big thing, is making sure that simulator is resembling that whatever block that aircraft is, so the student is, or the pilot is actually seeing what they're going to see real world there. So this next question is actually something we were actually talking about earlier before the panel. We sat down and talked about how long, if we see something great on the floor today, how long does it take for us, we get it, and to be able to use it operational. So the question is, the Air Force has been historically risk averse. What risks are you willing to accept to streamline acquisition and development to meet the pacing threat?
So I would say under the new alignment of PEO training, a lot of the programs in my division work through the same Advanced Simulator Capabilities Office, the WNR, and I would just give a shout out and a lot of credit to some of the things that they've been doing. In addition to some of the things the acquisition community has done over the past few years to include rapid prototyping and mid-tier acquisitions and a lot of cyber activity, a lot of innovative ways to get the industrial base stimulated. WNR has done a lot of cooperative research and development agreements, which is essentially taking that standard that I keep referencing, providing it along with a hardware and software baseline called the JSC Technical Baseline, and they're essentially under agreement with industry providing that software and hardware for them to put into their hardware in the loop and their software in the loop labs back at their home station. So when they're developing a new missile or a new sensor or a new platform, whatever it happens to be, when they're looking to test it to see how it's going to perform to spec, at the same time they're testing how it's going to be doing in the same virtual environment that the Air Force will then take it and do its operational test and its training on. So I think the core piece of the answer here is that I think finding ways to provide these common standards, out to industry so that they can start developing on those very same types of software and pieces of equipment, it only shortens that timeline from development to training to proficiency and hence a true capability.
I like that question because it's both sides of the coin. One side, I don't like the end user and industry's touch point to make 1 million handmade wooden shoes that don't necessarily meet under the grander strategy of what does our night one fight look like. But the flip side of that is, obviously there's a need there. So we're missing something if the end user is saying, I need this handmade wooden shoe, and the industry's like, I've got this awesome handmade wooden shoe to give to you. And then how do we then incorporate that into the master plan? And an example is Phoenix. So we, through some great teamwork with USAFE Warfare Center and some industry partners in the Navy, we have now an effects-based F-35 that can rapidly get out there for cheap 8-ship tactics, which is the requirement for F-35 folks, in a coalition and joint environment that builds towards JSE is like getting fielded out there. So the original question was risk. I mean, end-of-year fallout money exists. Like, that is not risk, so that's good. There is opportunities out there to see what the end users are doing. It's my job, our job, to get out there and listen on the government side of what are we missing? What do we need to incorporate into the strategy? And we're trying to do that. And we've got events like this where we're all together doing that together, so that's good. So both sides, I love you for doing it, but but maybe not all the time. But keep doing it, please, because again, it's filling a gap that we are missing clearly. So keep it up.
So I'd say I'm for high risk at the onset, when it's nascent, when it's growing. Let's fail early if it's going to fail. But by the time it's time to deliver it to the warfighter, it needs to be tight. It needs to be squared away, and it can't fail. Again, we're talking about using startup monies to get something durable. If I think about it, those simulators that are still working for 50 years, that's a pretty impressive feat when you think about it. None of you are really driving a 50-year-old vehicle, potentially, unless you love classic cars, right? But there's a lot of old technology inside of that. So I'd say I would be much less risk-averse to failing early. I would love to see actual full-fledged prototypes delivered versus ideas. So that would be my concern, is that we have something delivered. It's high risk. It's PowerPoint deep. There's thought that's gone into it, but it's still future us projects. That's my biggest concern with the risk calculus. Is it future science? Is it something that's on the shelves today? Is it something that you can deliver in a time span of what our young warfighters need? I can't tell you the number of times I was just floored by making promises with funds that I had to these young warfighters that I couldn't deliver in a timely and relevant manner. There's nothing worse than that. I still look back on projects that I promised to deliver, we spent the funds to provide, and they still don't have the capability. I think we collectively can do better on that, and I think it starts with the military basically saying, this is a best of breed, we're gonna support it, and we're gonna field it. So that's a lament in my part, seeing what we have. I will say we still have the greatest armed force in the world, but I think that we need to fail early and often, and I think we need to go all in once we find a winner.
I agree, right? It's, I think, bring it fast, bring it now, let us iterate and get after it, right? And then figure out what works for the majority and let's pump it. The one thing I would say, though, that has made it difficult is innovation funds down at the wing levels, right? Those are great, and they I think, spark innovation and stuff, but what we end up with, just as I've mentioned a couple times now, is a lot of different niche capabilities with zero sustainment tail, right? So they buy a set of VR goggles, and then, after, when they break or when the software is outdated, they come to the Majcom, right, and ask for, hey, what's next? And we don't even know it exists, right, because it's happening down there at the unit. So there needs to be an aggregation. I think there needs to be a holistic approach to this, but I am a fan of bringing it in early, bringing it in now. Let's iterate on it, fail early, fail often, and then make sure it is tight before we push it out to the warfighter with a larger strategic vision.
I think a lot of the risk that we're all talking about is in time. And so time to be able to look at something, evaluate it, and then make a decision. And in this room earlier, we listened to PEO training, which I think is an outstanding reorganization effort. Colonel Kionis briefed what his organization is doing. But those are very, for the most part, large projects. For ABSOC, our other parent command, United States SOCOM, indicated this week that they were more willing to try things out. But I'll reference back to the beginning of our conversation here. That price of admission is what we're trying out has to connect with what we have. And so as we're able to pursue both acquisition cycles, at least in ABSOC, we're willing to take a lot of risk to bring something to bear sooner. Even if it doesn't work, at least we were moving in the forward direction.
I'd say one thing that we don't articulate well either. The majority of what we're doing right now is evolving current capability. It's an evolution. It's not necessarily a revolution. And so I would say go all in if you've got them for those revolutionary ways of warfighting, that moonshot, if you will, because we haven't seen that. We're just making things better, faster. The speed of warfare, better, faster, the weapons longer range and more kinetically relevant, but we're not revolutionizing. So this is a great forum for that. You probably saw parts and pieces that would allow you to think about the problem in a different way. So if you have something revolutionary, please bring it, and I think the armed force will fall in line trying to make that a reality. I guarantee you our adversaries are.
So not to be contrarian, but I figured it might be good to have a little bit of an opposing viewpoint. I think one of my pet peeves is a lot of people accept risk, and they say I accept the risk, and that's great as long as there's a risk assessment made and they understand the risk. And so we talk a lot about accepting risk, fail forward, those types of things. What I don't think anybody is really prepared to do is risk or accept that risk to readiness. So when we talk about delivering new training systems, at the forefront to that, and I think that's not only a theme at ITSEC, but for the DoD in general, is that I don't think anybody would raise their hand in this room and say, I accept that risk to readiness. And so when we talk about fielded systems and we want to deliver new capabilities, we have to keep our eye on maintaining readiness. And this is in the context, again, kind of going back to some systems that are shouldering the burden, that are getting our aircrew and our warfighters trained to go out the door and deploy and fight today's fight. When we're onboarding new capabilities, there will be a period of time where the resources will be required to develop the new system and accept the risk of accepting that new system, but we cannot do it at the cost of maintaining our readiness. And so, in my own world, we have JSE and DMO kind of looking at each other going, hey, I'm the future. Hey, I'm doing the job today. And so it's just an interesting thing to point out, I think, when we talk about risk, because everybody seems to be very open to accepting risk, but I think we also have that conversation about what are we not willing to take risk on, and I think that's one of the big answers.
Yeah, I think we accept risk to readiness every single day, though. And I think a lot of the toys and the technology that we see out on the floor help us mitigate that risk, right? Because at least from a mobility community perspective, our crew force and our aircraft are in the system every single day, globally, all over, right? And the tasking tempo that we see is at the expense of readiness. It is at the expense of dedicated training time. So finding new and novel ways for them to train without an aircraft in a minimum amount of time absolutely mitigates that risk of training. But the geopolitical environment it risks our ability to train every single day as our C-17s, as our C-130s are deployed. Our KC-135s are flying around the globe, taking the CAF where they need to be and when. Using and capitalizing on technology to try and mitigate that risk is absolutely essential. Because we're not making many more flying hours. The Air Force isn't awarding us any additional flying hours. It's actually going down, and a lot of it's transitioning to the sim, which we're maximizing capacity at 22 hours a day, 6 days a week already as well. So it's finding some novel ways to increase readiness, make sure folks can get air refueling plugs in the squadron is something we've talked a lot about this week. So you're maximizing that touch time in the aircraft when you do get it.
Okay. This is another question, but it kind of piggybacks on what I spoke about earlier about train like we fight. When is the last time we can ever remember the United States Air Force, we went to war by ourselves? We got someone that's coming with us, one of our joint partners or our coalition partners. So the question we have on hand is, playing in different sandboxes was mentioned in a reference to simulated environments. LVC is often mentioned alongside with JSE. Do you anticipate a need to unify or cooperate with other services to ensure pilot experiences joint training at the same level of experience?
I'd say absolutely. Today you see it with our allies and partners holistically. They bring capabilities to the fight that we may not even have in our inventory for the DoD. And I think that's wildly, as it should be, actually. We're going to show up to the fight, and one which we may not be able to call the time and place of, with the allies who are going to join us. And I absolutely love that. If we're not practicing with them, if we're not training with them, if we're not connecting to them, then we're going to miss out on being able to fight effectively. There's just no way around it. We cannot look at a problem set like the Pacific and go it alone. You may be able to do it for a day, but at the end, it's going to require all of us in that fight. The same with the one in NATO, in Europe today. We see that every day on the battlefields in the Ukraine. I think we have to be able to work together in this environment. Of course, it brings in the conundrums of clearance levels and the ability to talk past each other. I always think that we're going to be able to take the shackles off if you have to go to war, but I'd much rather train in peace versus having to get to that point where we have to do that. That's my 2 cents, and having traveled the globe, I've always seen ready, capable, and innovative. It's a beautiful thing. We may look at the world a certain way. Our allies and partners will certainly see it a different one.
Yeah, LVC is definitely a capability that everybody's interested in. You know, particularly the Navy has made a lot of headway in their NCTE environment, and I think they're looking to actually apply that DoD-wide. But specifically talking about JSE and connecting it into the LVC, I would say I think that's a long-term goal, but I would ask, part of the discussion I think would be, it doesn't always have to be, we don't have to connect to everything. And I think an example of that would be, we can have different solutions for different problems. So Phoenix, Harm brought up Phoenix earlier, which is an amazing program that fills a huge capability gap, but it doesn't need to connect to JSE because the objective of what you're getting out of Phoenix is, allied partners and nations, a security level that everybody can participate at, a low-cost option for F-35 to train in an 8-ship fighting formation. All of those things at a cheap price, I don't want to ruin that by putting some requirement on it that it has to connect into a super high-fidelity environment because that would kind of ruin the goodness of it. But at the end of the day, LVC, there are other options that the Air Force is bringing to bear and sharing with the Navy. And the P6 Combat Training System, or TIX-2 as it's called in the Navy, provides kind of a similar capability to connect aircraft, introduce constructive entities, even connect into virtual players that are participating over DMO or other types of environments. So at the end of the day, I think what my answer to that would be is, yes, at some point it should be on the roadmap to try to connect everything. But I think what we really need to look at is what are the capabilities that we want. We want to do some sort of LVC, and I think we have a capability that may be nearer term that we could fill that gap with something like TIX-2.
Yeah, I think as long as they're complementary, right? I don't think you have to compete the two, right? Whether it be JSE or DMO or where, especially because clearance level is prohibitive. And we see that firsthand, in the MAF community where, we're operating DMO at that secret level, right? At JSE, I think goes much higher than that. And we are integrating with our allies and the Australians and we've been talking about this week, UK coming into that environment and training with us as well. So I do think there's complementary aspects, and I don't think you have to have one or the other because there's definitely goodness in both.
I think the answer is obviously a resounding yes. You're going to hear all of us say that. And I take a little bit of different tact on the answer, whether it be DMO or LVC. I talked before, we may not know the exact nature of our future conflict. We contemplate one, we may not know that. But we generally know who we're going to be allied with. We know who's going to be in the fight, generally. And so as we participate in missions, the mission that we're training may not be as important as who we're training with. And so if we're training with all our allies and partners and joint force, then we push the understanding of our allies, our partners, our joint force, and how they do things down to the lowest tactical level. So the folks that, if we end up in a conflict or executing the conflict, know more about the joint and combined force than ever previously. And that gives them a huge advantage no matter what the mission that may come out. And I think that's very, very important for LVC, DMO, that train together. And obviously from a special ops background, that is kind of our battle cry, if you will. So get to know each other, get to know what our motivations, how each aspect of the force participates, and more importantly, debrief together so you can understand exactly what happened. And it's always interesting, I believe, is if you're training, that the enemy doesn't always follow their doctrine, or the friendly forces don't always follow the correct procedures. I've learned a lot from my mistakes in my career, and I've learned a hell of a lot for watching other people's mistakes. It's just easier to watch other people's mistakes in the debrief. But the learning exists there, and that's where we want to be able to do in our LVC and DMO. Thanks.
I'd like to complement that. The reality is that we're probably talking past each other, and potentially we've made it more difficult than it needs to be. At the tactical level, it's shoot, move, and communicate. I don't care what platform you're talking about. That's what the reality is. I would say that debrief is where you're going to make your learning. I can't tell you the number of times, and the B-52 is a fantastic model. We still use a pencil and paper from the IPC to mark how well we've done. It's old school, really old school. But the reality is that debrief is where you learn. You take the knowledge that you have to the airplane, you execute violently, and then you debrief. And so that is the true blessing of a connected environment. I think we need to go for it as hard as we can. At the end of the day, if we cannot talk and debrief, we've failed miserably. And so I just foot stomped that. We have to get past the parochialisms in order to get to a better conversation, I think. And that may be just an instance. It may be an instance of a B-52, and now we're just talking about the weapons that it brings, because I think we need to get to a common vernacular as we're working across the globe. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and I definitely piggyback on that debrief point. I didn't realize that till I went off to WIC, how important the debrief was, and it was always something prior to me going that was the shortest part of the mission. You were done the mission, you want a quick debrief and go home. But that's where the learning takes place. That's when folks can say where their mistakes were, and now you take those and you apply those to your next flight there. Earlier during the conversation we were talking about during AI, it was mentioned that if there's another conflict, it's going to be fast because of the emerging capabilities that are out there. So the question I have from the audience is, I've heard EW mentioned many times this week. How will you incorporate a non-kinetic effects layered into JSE at the response speed necessary to keep pace with that emerging capability?
So I think it's kind of it's built into the question. I mean, if you had to take JSE and strip it down to its most fundamental capability, it is to replicate the physical world and specifically the electromagnetic spectrum. And so other than putting these types of capabilities into an echo chamber or into a chamber and seeing how they actually perform in the real world, this is what JSE was designed to do. What I think the challenging part is as we're developing those capabilities, also developing the models that accurately represent what they would do in the physical world. So, we quickly spiral into a very nerdy conversation that I can't hang with, but what I would say is that the environment is there and built to react as appropriately and as accurately as it can outside of the physical world. The challenge again is just as we go to industry and we tell them the types of effects that we want to generate and the types of hardware that we need to generate them, we have to find a way to mimic what the electromagnetic warfare or the EW effect is in the environment. Because I think we're accurately reflecting the environment, but we need to accurately replicate the effect. And if we're able to actually do that and validate that, I think we're going to get better at it. And this is where we're looking to our friends out at Edwards, the DT folks, the 445th, who really know how to validate this type of stuff. They're going to take it into the bath out at Edwards, and they're going to start shooting that EW into the bath, and they're going to use all of that real world equipment to do the best they can to approximate what that looks like. They're going to throw it into the JSE, and they're going to compare those two things side by side. And after we get a couple of repetitions at that, we're going to give industry a lot more feedback, and they're going to better be able to replicate all of those things at a more rapid pace. So I think we're really learning how to do that at a very high fidelity. I don't know that JSE is always the best place to do that. Again, it takes the oxygen out of the room. There are a lot of other analysis tools that can work on a pulse-to-pulse level and can really tell you what your effects are going to be. At some point, you're going to come into the JSE and realize, well, it is not the highest fidelity when it comes to pulse to pulse, but it is very high fidelity in replicating the effect and the response to that effect, not just off of the victim emitter potentially, but maybe off of every surface in that environment to include friendlies. You know what I mean? We're going to learn things that we didn't even think would be a problem.
That's a devious question, well played, audience. The reality is, we're at a crossroads, quite frankly. Are our systems capable of keeping up with the spectrum, yes or no? The reality is, when you wind in cyber into that, you've now placed it into a realm of the classification well above potentially the capability of whatever simulation we're using, because they're spurious. You use a technique and it's gone, or it's been given away. And so I think we need to certainly have it baked into the environment. It needs to be there. We need to be having our IMSO warriors having that fight electronically to showcase that. Daily, our cyber warriors are fighting off threats to the system, but those are not durable. They're transient. You need to, with these 6th-gen capabilities that we're bringing, have an IMSO capability baked into it. It doesn't change the physics. We can't fix that. The reality is it's got to be baked into everything we do, at which we haven't had that conversation. Over the friendly skies of Afghanistan, didn't have to worry about it at all. I guarantee the next fight we all will.
Okay. I'm going to wrap one more question. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to wrap it up as you want. Save this one for last. We spoke about it earlier. I think Colonel Dahlman and I, we've had a couple conversations regarding this in authority to operate versus risk to readiness. How do you define and how do you draw the line of where do you go?
So I'll be very strong opinions. I'll be very blatant, right? I think the current standards for authority to operate inhibit readiness, right? And I'll explain a little bit, right? So authority to operate is our ability to connect the systems to the network, right? So our systems. We're talking 50-year-old systems, like I mentioned. I'll use my KC-135 systems, for example. The cybersecurity requirements to connect those 50-year-old systems are unrealistic, in our current world, right? And we've had conversations specifically from a MAF to Headquarters Air Force to keep my systems online so I can continue to train aircrew for the high-end fight. Distributed mission operations is the way we do that. We immerse our crews into an environment in which they can't get anywhere else. They don't have the range times. They don't have the time to go TDY. They can rarely get into a red flag exercise. These kind of environments are not accessible to the general aircrew public, right? And it's being able to immerse them in a DMO environment, from their CONUS base where they're doing it for a 4-hour block, 5-hour block of time, vice a 4 or 5 day TDY, is exceptionally valuable. And when I lose my authority to operate because I have not met cybersecurity standards, it wipes that capability out. It unplugs that SIM from the network. That said, that's a problem across all my platforms. KC-135 is one of my most troubled platforms because they've been in operation for so long, and we're fighting obsolescence is the term that we use, right? So that's think of it, they're operating on Windows XP, and I need them on Windows 11 or whatever the most recent is, right? And we're working through that, and I'm working very closely with Air Force Materiel Command, the Lifecycle Management Center, to fund. We're throwing tens of millions of dollars at these simulators, but they take time to do it. And even if the Air Force gave me every bit of money I needed to upgrade every single one of my KC-135 simulators, I can't afford as a training, as the training guy, to take all of those sims down, right? I need aircrew. We depend on those because we're not getting the reps and sets in the airplane. I depend on those, not even in the DMO environment, just for the takeoffs, the landings, the approaches, the air refuelings, the the integration across and to meet their training beings needed. But the authority to operate is something that we're combating every single day, and to maintain it. And right now in the KC-135 specifically, I get it on. This is a 6-month battle that we fight. As we continue to upgrade systems, as we continue to decrease that obsolescence and lower that cybersecurity vulnerability score, but it takes times. I'm talking years, right? So I am an advocate of accepting some risk, right? Raising that cybersecurity vulnerability, allowing us to connect, to increase readiness, to allow us to connect the max amount of SIMs I can to the network to ensure my aircrew are prepared and ready to fight tonight. I don't have a lot of concern at the level that the mobility air forces are operating, that you name it adversary is in my systems, watching my tactics, techniques, procedures, watching us operate, right? So I believe that risk is low, and I will hop off my soapbox at this point, but I do think the authority to operate it's critical. Cybersecurity is critical. The SCARS, the Common Architecture System Standards, is critical to increasing cybersecurity across the spectrum, right? Attacking obsolescence is absolutely critical. It has, we let it go for too long in the math, and we're playing catch up now.
Yeah, I'll hop on that soapbox with you. The reality, though, what I see is oftentimes we fight ourselves more than the adversary does. We've denied ourselves a capability that the adversary never would have intended. So it's denial of a capability that we need. Now, I also understand the why behind it. Oftentimes we've been told to fix ourselves for a decade, and we failed to put the money where we needed to fix it. But there's so many times that I've seen lack of capability or a loss of capability because we couldn't operate. The number of times I've had angry contractor in my office complaining about the mission planning systems getting tore up again because of the walls that we put up around ourselves. So I think I would advocate along with you to bear a little bit of risk, to connect when we need to, find the solution to shore up those programs, to make them compliant, because that's the other way we roll. I'm not compliant, I'll never will be, I'm gonna continue to use it. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do business either, but I certainly wanna make sure that we don't do the enemy's job for us, and quite frankly, if they're in our systems, I sure would hope they'd fix my NIPRNet. So.
Yeah, I said I saved this one for last. Justin and I, we've had a number of conversations regarding the authority to operate versus readiness. And there's a fine line, but I do agree, we kind of put ourselves in a situation where we kept saying we were going to get around to it. In 10 years, we haven't changed it. But now we got to also think about readiness, though. I got it. Mistakes were made 10 years ago. But we also got to make sure those air crew are ready for that night one fight. And if I upgrade my system with cyber, it's not a quick fix. I've got to take that platform, that SIM, out of training, so X number of crews aren't being trained at that. So, okay, well, I want to appreciate the panel. I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes for any wrap-up comments you'd like to make. And I want to say once again, thank you guys. Well, go ahead, Harm, if you like.
We have a giant red clock up here that says 1 minute and 46 seconds. We're going to hit that. Thank you to the panel members. Hopefully, to the audience, we had a thought-provoking conversation. I definitely learned a lot out here. I like to keep the organization flat, so please reach out to me. I want to know what you're doing. I want to know how we can get the warfighters what they need, because the only way we win this war from stealing from war games 1983 with AI computers, the only way we win is if we don't fight the war. So deterrence, that's how we win, guys. So please keep it flat. Let me know what you're doing, how I can help, how we can get the warfighter what they need. Thank you.
Oh, I just echo that. What a great group of folks here to kind of wrap your mind around difficult things. If they were easy, you'd have already solved it for us. So thank you for putting in the time, the energy, and the resources to fix our problems. Please do remember that at the end of the day, it's not about a bunch of old guys on the stage. It's about young airmen that just joined the military. They're coming into a world that is nothing like the one that I started out 20 years, 30 years ago. But the reality is they are going to want a capability that you will bring and that you'll innovate to get to them. Just do it quicker. Bring it. Don't be scared to fail, and then just help us. I'll echo the same thing. If you have anything that you need, come directly to me. I can't fix it if I don't know it's broke or if we need to start working in a different direction. So thank you, though, very much for your time and your energies.
Yeah, I just say ABC, thanks for moderating and providing all the questions for us. I think it was a great opportunity to, give our kind of pain points and opinions and needs and wants to the assembled group here at ITSEC. And generically speaking, it's been great to be at ITSEC another year. I'm looking forward to coming back next year. I'm surprised they invited me back this time, but we'll see what happens next year.
Thanks.
Yeah, really have enjoyed the conference, and it's there's good ideas out there, and none of the good ideas emanate from this stage, right? We depend on conferences like this to walk the floor, and our young air crew and airmen to really allow this to open up the aperture and spark great ideas. So bring them forward, right? And it's I would ask have a thought in the back of your mind, and keep in mind how do we integrate that capability into the greater spectrum of training and emulation, and how do we keep it from not being a one-trick pony and a niche capability, but we can integrate it across all with a sustainable training tool going forward. But appreciate the opportunity.
My role, in the interest of time, is to say thank you and get off the stage. But thank you for this week of learning. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot in this panel. So thank you very much for moderating this.
Thanks. And once again, thanks to the panel. And thank you guys for the questions. And I hope you guys have a good afternoon.